Close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath in. And let it go. You are safe. You are warm. And tonight, I'm going to take you somewhere far away. Back through the long, quiet corridors of time, to a world that no longer exists. A world of gaslit cobblestone streets, of grand empires stretching across whole continents, of emperors in gilded palaces, and ordinary people, farmers, shopkeepers, schoolchildren, who had no idea that the world they knew was about to end forever. Tonight's story begins, a long time before the guns. It begins not with a single moment, but with a slow, creeping tension. Like the pressure that builds inside the earth before a great earthquake. You cannot see it. You cannot touch it. But it is there, beneath everything, quietly, growing. This is the story of the First World War. But more than that, it is the story of why. Let us begin in the year 1815. 100 years before the war. In the great city of Vienna, the capital of the Austrian Empire, the most powerful men in Europe had gathered around long, candlelit tables. The Napoleonic Wars had just ended. France had been defeated. And now, the kings and emperors and diplomats of Europe were deciding how to put the world back together. They redrew the maps. They shuffled borders like cards. And they made a simple agreement, one that would shape the next century of European life. The agreement was this: no single nation would ever again be allowed to dominate all of Europe. There would be a balance of power. A careful, delicate balance. Like a chandelier hanging from a single thread, spectacular to look at, but fragile in a way that no one liked to think about. For a while, it worked. The decades that followed were, by the standards of history, remarkably peaceful in Western Europe. There were wars, there are always wars, but nothing that swallowed the whole continent whole. And in those decades of relative peace, something else was happening. Europe was growing. Growing in ways that had never been seen before. Imagine, for a moment, that you are standing in London in the year 1880. It is a foggy autumn evening. The gas lamps are flickering on along the great wide boulevards. You can hear the clatter of horse-drawn carriages on the cobblestones, the distant cry of a newspaper boy, the low rumble of a city alive with industry. London, at this moment, is the center of the world. The British Empire, the largest empire in the history of human civilization, covers nearly a quarter of the entire globe. From the green hills of Ireland in the west, to the sweeping plains of India in the east, to the golden savannas of southern Africa, wherever you go, you will find the British flag. And Britain is not alone. France has an empire too, stretching across West Africa, Southeast Asia, the Caribbean. The Dutch have Indonesia. The Belgians have the Congo. And Germany. Germany. Germany is the young one. Germany, as a unified nation, is only 9 years old in 1880. Before 1871, it had simply been a loose collection of kingdoms and principalities, Prussia, Bavaria, Saxony, scattered across Central Europe like puzzle pieces that had never quite been fitted together. But in 1871, under the iron guidance of a man named Otto von Bismarck, the pieces came together at last. And a new power was born. Otto von Bismarck was not a warm man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a great white moustache and eyes that had the cool, steady quality of someone who had calculated the weight of everything, and found most things wanting. He was called the Iron Chancellor. And that name suited him perfectly. Bismarck understood power the way a clockmaker understands gears. He knew which lever to pull, which alliance to forge, which war to start, and, crucially, which wars to avoid. Under his leadership, the new German Empire grew quickly, but carefully. He kept his nation at peace with its neighbors through a complex web of treaties and agreements. But in 1890, Bismarck was dismissed. The young Kaiser, Emperor, Wilhelm II, had grown tired of his chancellor's cautious hand. Wilhelm was 29 years old. He was brilliant in some ways, impulsive in others. He had a withered left arm, an injury from birth, which some historians believe left him with a deep, lifelong need to prove himself. To be strong. To be feared. To be admired. He wanted Germany to have what Britain had. What France had. He wanted a place in the sun, that was actually the phrase he used. A place in the sun. A great navy. Colonies overseas. Respect on the world stage. And so Germany began to build. It built ships, enormous, powerful warships that made Britain very nervous indeed. It built its army, already the finest fighting force in Europe, into something even larger. And it began to look around the world, with hungry eyes. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Because the causes of the First World War are not a single story. They are many stories, woven together. A tapestry of ambition and fear, of old wounds and new rivalries, of nations that trusted each other less and less, with every passing year. And to understand it all, we need to let our minds drift a little further back. We need to talk about something called nationalism. A feeling. An idea. Simple on the surface, but underneath. Terribly, terribly powerful. Close your eyes a little more now. Let your breathing slow. And I will tell you about the idea that changed everything. Nationalism. It is a word that gets used a great deal, in history books, in classrooms, in arguments between people who care very much about the past. But let us set the textbooks aside for a moment. And instead, imagine a feeling. Picture a village. A small village, somewhere in the heart of Europe. Let us say it is nestled in a valley, surrounded by low green hills. There is a church with a stone tower at the center of things. A market square with a fountain. A baker who opens his shutters every morning before the sun has fully risen, and fills the cold air with the smell of warm bread. The people of this village speak the same language. They sing the same songs at harvest time. They tell the same stories to their children at night, stories of heroes and saints and ancient battles fought in these very hills, centuries ago. They share something that is very hard to put into words. A sense of us. A sense that these people, my people, are bound together by something deeper than laws or borders or the name of whatever king happens to sit on a distant throne. That feeling is the seed of nationalism. And for most of human history, it was simply there. Quiet. Warm. The background hum of belonging. But in the 19th century, someone decided to turn up the volume. The French Revolution, at the end of the 1700s, had done something remarkable. For centuries, the people of Europe had thought of themselves primarily as subjects of a king, or a duke, or an emperor. Your loyalty was to your ruler. Your identity was shaped by your religion, your village, your guild. But the revolution introduced a new idea. The people are the nation. Not the king. Not the aristocracy. The people. And with that, everything shifted. Across Europe, men and women began to ask new questions. Questions that had never quite been asked so loudly before. Who are we, really? What language do we speak? What blood runs in our veins? What land do we belong to? And why are we being ruled by people who are not like us? That last question was the dangerous one. Because Europe, in the 19th century, was a continent of empires. And empires, almost by definition, are made up of many different peoples, many different languages, many different cultures, all pressed together under a single flag, whether they like it or not. The Austrian Empire, for example, one of the oldest and most powerful on the continent, contained within its borders not just Austrians, but Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Croats, Slovenes, Italians, and more. All these peoples, all these languages, all these histories. And over all of them, the Habsburg dynasty. An ancient German-speaking royal family, ruling from Vienna. For a long time, this had simply been the way of things. But nationalism was changing the way people thought. And some of those peoples, the Czechs, the Hungarians, the Slovenes, were beginning to whisper amongst themselves. We are a people. We have our own language, our own history, our own heroes. Why should someone else rule us? Of all the peoples in the great patchwork of the Austrian Empire and the lands around it, none burned with national feeling quite so intensely as the Serbs. The Serbs were a South Slavic people, proud, fiercely independent, with a history stretching back centuries. They had their own Orthodox Christian faith, their own rich literary tradition, their own epic poetry that spoke of knights and battles and the eternal longing for freedom. For much of their history, the Serbs had lived under the rule of the Ottoman Empire, the great Turkish Empire that had dominated southeastern Europe for hundreds of years. But in the early 1800s, they had fought back. There had been uprisings, rebellions, long, bloody, grinding struggles against Ottoman rule. And eventually, Serbia had won a measure of independence. By the mid-19th century, Serbia was its own small kingdom. Proud, scrappy, determined. But it was surrounded on all sides by larger, more powerful neighbors. And its national dream was far from complete. Because scattered across the region, in Bosnia, in Croatia, in other territories controlled by Austria-Hungary, there were millions of South Slavic people. Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, people who spoke related languages, who shared cultural and religious ties with Serbia. The dream, the great Serbian national dream, was to bring all of these people together. One nation. One people. Yugoslavia, the land of the South Slavs. It was a beautiful dream. And it was a dream that terrified Austria-Hungary. You can understand, perhaps, why. Put yourself in the position of the old empire for a moment. You are Austria-Hungary. You are ancient, your ruling dynasty has been in power since the 13th century. You stretch across a vast swathe of Central Europe. You are home to dozens of different peoples. And nationalism, this new, restless, hungry idea, is spreading through your lands like a slow fire through dry grass. If the Serbs get their nation, what next? The Czechs will want theirs. The Poles will want theirs. The Hungarians, who already have a degree of self-rule, will want more. The whole edifice, the whole great, creaking, magnificent structure of the empire, could simply fall apart. And so Austria-Hungary watched Serbia with a combination of contempt and cold fear. Serbia was small. Serbia was poor. Serbia had a population of only a few million, compared to Austria-Hungary's 50 million. But Serbia had ideas. And ideas, as empires have always known, are the most dangerous weapons of all. Let your body sink a little deeper now. Feel the weight of your limbs against the mattress. Your breathing is slow and easy. There is nothing to do right now. Nowhere to be. Just this quiet journey through a world long since past. The fire is low. The night is dark and still. And in that stillness, I want to tell you about a place. A place that, in the years before the First World War, had come to be known by a rather ominous name. They called it, the powder keg of Europe. The Balkans. Say the word slowly and you can almost hear the weight of history in it. The Balkans is the name for the peninsula that juts southward from Europe into the warm waters of the Mediterranean, the region we now call the former Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Albania, Greece, and parts of Romania and Turkey. It is a land of extraordinary beauty. Mountain ranges that catch the clouds and hold them like cupped hands. Deep river valleys where mist lingers in the mornings. Ancient stone cities perched on hilltops, where you can stand and see for 50 miles in every direction. But it is also a land where borders have always been contested, where empires have always collided, and where the question of who belongs here has never had a simple answer. For centuries, the Balkans had been divided between two great powers, the Ottoman Empire to the south and east, and the Austrian Empire to the north and west. The two great rivals, pressing against each other across this rugged, complicated, beautiful land. But by the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was collapsing. Slowly. Painfully. With great dignity and great suffering. It had once been one of the most powerful empires on earth. At its height, it had stretched from the gates of Vienna to the borders of Persia, from North Africa to the Caucasus Mountains. Its armies had terrified Europe for 300 years. But now, it was retreating. Bit by bit, territory by territory, the Ottoman Empire was losing its grip on the Balkans. And as it withdrew, it left behind a vacuum. And into that vacuum rushed all the old rivalries, all the national dreams, all the competing ambitions that had been building for decades. The Serbs wanted more territory. The Bulgarians wanted more territory. The Greeks wanted more territory. And Austria-Hungary watched all of this with growing alarm, knowing that whatever emerged from the wreckage of the Ottoman retreat would reshape the balance of power in a region it considered its own backyard. The powder keg was being loaded. Quietly. Slowly. Grain by grain. The powder keg was being loaded. But a powder keg, on its own, is not dangerous. It needs a spark. And before the spark could come, something else had to happen first. Europe had to tie itself together. Let us go back, for a moment, to our old friend Otto von Bismarck. The Iron Chancellor. The man who had built Germany. Bismarck, for all his faults, and he had many, was a realist. He understood the delicate balance of power that held Europe together. And he understood, more than almost anyone, that a unified Germany, powerful, central, ambitious, made its neighbors nervous. France, in particular. France had never forgotten or forgiven what had happened in 1871, when Prussian forces had swept across the border, besieged Paris, and forced France to hand over two of its most cherished provinces, Alsace and Lorraine, along with 5 billion gold francs in reparations. It was a humiliation. Deep and raw. And Bismarck knew that France would one day seek revenge. So he set about making sure that when that day came, France would be alone. His method was alliances. Not the simple, old-fashioned alliances of kings pledging loyalty to one another over a cup of wine. These were formal, legal, written agreements. Treaties with clauses and conditions and secret protocols. Diplomatic architecture of extraordinary complexity. In 1879, Germany and Austria-Hungary signed the Dual Alliance, a promise that if either nation were attacked, the other would come to its aid. In 1882, Italy joined them. The alliance became the Triple Alliance. Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy. 3 empires, bound together. Bismarck also maintained a separate, secret treaty with Russia, the Reinsurance Treaty, he called it, just to keep Russia from drifting toward France. It was, by any measure, a masterpiece of diplomatic juggling. But then, in 1890, Bismarck was dismissed. And the juggler left the stage. The new men who took charge of German foreign policy did not have Bismarck's patience or his subtlety. They allowed the Reinsurance Treaty with Russia to lapse. They didn't renew it. They thought it unnecessary. It was one of the great miscalculations of the age. Because Russia, suddenly finding itself without a German guarantee, began to look elsewhere for security. And France, isolated, resentful, still nursing the wound of 1871, was looking for a friend. In 1894, France and Russia signed an alliance. It was, in many ways, an unlikely pairing. France was a republic, noisy, democratic, often chaotic. Russia was an autocracy, vast, slow, ruled by a Tsar whose word was absolute law. They had little in common culturally or politically. But they had something more important in common. They were both afraid of Germany. And fear, as history shows again and again, makes for very reliable allies. Now Europe had two armed camps taking shape. On one side, the Triple Alliance. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. On the other, France and Russia. And in the middle, watching all of this with careful, slightly anxious eyes, Britain. For most of the 19th century, Britain had followed a policy known as splendid isolation. The phrase itself tells you everything. Britain, protected by the English Channel and the greatest navy the world had ever seen, had always felt that the messy business of continental alliances was best left to the continentals. Britain had its empire to manage. It had trade routes to protect. It had no particular interest in pledging itself to anyone else's quarrels. But by the early 1900s, splendid isolation was beginning to feel less splendid. Germany's navy was the problem. Kaiser Wilhelm's great shipbuilding program, his determination to match Britain on the seas, had shaken Britain deeply. The British had always assumed that naval supremacy was simply theirs. It was the foundation of everything, their empire, their trade, their security. And now Germany was building battleships. Big ones. Fast ones. The kind of ships that said, very clearly, we are coming for your place in the world. Britain responded by building more ships of its own. Bigger ones. The great HMS Dreadnought, launched in 1906, was so powerful, so revolutionary, that it made every other battleship in the world obsolete overnight. But the arms race had begun. And arms races, once started, have their own terrible momentum. Britain began, quietly and carefully, to draw closer to France. In 1904, they signed the Entente Cordiale, a French phrase meaning, roughly, a friendly understanding. It was not a full military alliance. Not yet. It was more like a handshake. An agreement to settle old colonial disputes and face the future together. But the direction of travel was clear. And in 1907, Britain also reached an agreement with Russia, the Anglo-Russian Convention, settling their long rivalry in Central Asia. Now the two camps had fully formed. On one side, the Triple Alliance. Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy. On the other, the Triple Entente. France, Russia, Britain. 6 of the most powerful nations on earth. Locked together in a system of promises. Breathe in. And out. Your body is heavy now. Wonderfully, comfortably heavy. Let the images of this old world drift through your mind like clouds. Gaslit offices where men in tall hats signed documents with careful, unhurried hands. Candlelit dining rooms where ambassadors leaned close and spoke in low voices. The soft scratch of a pen on paper. A wax seal pressed into a document. A handshake across a table. Small, quiet moments that were quietly changing everything. Now, here is the thing about the alliance system that everyone understood, and yet somehow no one quite believed would matter. The alliances were not just promises of friendship. They were promises of war. The logic was meant to be a deterrent. If country A knew that attacking country B would automatically bring in countries C, D, and E, then country A would think very carefully before doing anything rash. Peace through mutually assured consequence. It was, in theory, quite sensible. But there was a flaw. The flaw was this: the system worked perfectly as long as every crisis stayed small. As long as the sparks were contained. As long as sensible men could sit down together and negotiate and compromise and send the diplomats home with handshakes and treaties, and no one had to actually call on their allies. And for a while, they managed it. there were crises. There were moments when the whole structure trembled. But the structure held. Until it didn't. Because built into the alliance system was something that none of its architects had fully reckoned with. Speed. The military plans of the great powers, particularly Germany, were built around the idea of moving fast. Striking quickly. Before the enemy could gather themselves. Germany's Great War Plan, the Schlieffen Plan, developed in the early 1900s, was built on a single terrifying assumption. If Germany ever found itself at war with both France in the west and Russia in the east, it could not fight both at the same time. It would be crushed between them. So the plan was to knock out France first. Quickly. 6 weeks, the planners estimated. A lightning strike through Belgium and into France, capturing Paris before Russia had even finished mobilizing its enormous but slow-moving armies. Then swing east. Deal with Russia. It was bold. It was precise. It was the product of years of meticulous planning. And it meant that if war ever came, Germany would have to act within days. Hours, even. There would be no time for second thoughts. No time for diplomats to find a solution. The machine, once set in motion, would be almost impossible to stop. The alliance system had turned Europe into a room full of mousetraps. And somewhere out there, a mouse was running. There is something about machines that people find very hard to resist. The 19th century had discovered this. It had discovered steam, and steel, and electricity, and the extraordinary, almost magical ability of human hands and human minds to build things that had never existed before. Factories. Railways. Telegraphs. Steamships. The world was changing faster than it ever had. Faster, perhaps, than it should have. And inevitably, some of those restless, inventive minds turned their attention to war. To understand the arms race that gripped Europe in the years before 1914, you need to understand how war had changed. For most of human history, warfare had been, in a terrible way, quite personal. Men stood close together. They could see each other's faces. They fought with swords and spears and bows, weapons that required strength and skill and physical courage in the most direct, immediate sense. Even the early age of muskets and cannons had not changed this entirely. Battles were still fought at relatively close range. A soldier could see the enemy he was fighting. But the Industrial Revolution changed all of that. New weapons were being developed at a pace that no previous generation could have imagined. The rifle, accurate, reliable, capable of firing many rounds per minute, had transformed infantry warfare. The machine gun, first used in earnest in the American Civil War in the 1860s, could fire hundreds of rounds per minute. A single gun, operated by 2 men, could hold off an entire charging infantry unit. Artillery had grown more powerful, more accurate, more devastating than anything the world had ever seen. The great siege guns of the German Krupp factory, enormous, steel monsters on wheeled carriages, could hurl shells weighing hundreds of kilograms over distances of many miles. And at sea, the transformation was equally profound. Let us linger for a moment on the ships. Because the naval arms race between Britain and Germany is one of the most vivid and telling stories of the whole pre-war period. It captures, perfectly, the combination of pride and fear and competition that was slowly pulling Europe apart. Britain, as we have mentioned, had always ruled the waves. The Royal Navy was not just a military force, it was the foundation of an entire worldview. Britain was an island nation. Its empire was held together by sea routes. Its food and its wealth arrived by ship. Without naval supremacy, Britain was simply a small, rainy island off the coast of Europe. The navy was, in a very real sense, everything. So when Kaiser Wilhelm began his great shipbuilding program in the late 1890s, Britain noticed immediately. The man behind Germany's naval expansion was Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, a broad, bearded man with an extraordinarily long forked beard that gave him the look of a rather determined sea creature. Tirpitz believed, passionately, that Germany needed a great fleet. Not to defeat Britain, he knew that was impossible, at least for now, but to make Britain think twice. To make the cost of fighting Germany too high. He called it the risk theory. Build enough ships, and Britain will not dare challenge Germany. Simple. Logical. Elegant, even. But Britain did not see it that way. Britain saw it as an existential threat. And so the race began. Germany built ships. Britain built more. Germany built bigger ships. Britain built bigger still. In 1906, the Royal Navy launched HMS Dreadnought, a ship so revolutionary that naval historians divide the history of warships into two eras. Before Dreadnought. And after. She was faster than anything afloat. Armed with 10 enormous 12-inch guns. Powered by steam turbines that drove her through the water at 21 knots. She made every other battleship in the world obsolete. Including Germany's. But Germany simply began building their own dreadnoughts. And so it went. Year after year. Ship after ship. Billion after billion of marks and pounds, poured into steel and coal and rivets and guns. By 1914, Britain had 29 dreadnoughts. Germany had 17. Neither side had blinked. Neither side had backed down. And the cost, not just in money, but in suspicion, in hostility, in the slow poisoning of relations between the two nations, was enormous. But the arms race was not only at sea. On land, the armies of Europe were growing in ways that would have seemed extraordinary to any general from a previous century. France, still haunted by its defeat in 1871, had rebuilt its army with fierce determination. Universal military service was introduced, every able-bodied young Frenchman was required to serve. By 1914, France could field an army of over 4 million men. Germany matched it. Germany exceeded it. The German army was the finest fighting force in the world, superbly trained, superbly equipped, led by officers who had studied war with the same rigor and dedication that a scientist brings to a laboratory. Russia had the largest army of all, enormous, sprawling, drawn from a population of over 150 million people. It was slow to mobilize, poorly equipped in places, and plagued by the inefficiencies of a vast and creaking imperial bureaucracy. But in sheer numbers, it was staggering. And Austria-Hungary. And the Ottoman Empire. And the smaller nations, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, all of them building, drilling, equipping. All of Europe was arming. And here is the thing about armies. Large, expensive, meticulously trained armies have a momentum of their own. You do not build an army of 4 million men and simply leave it sitting quietly in barracks. You develop plans, strategies, timetables. You work out, in precise and careful detail, exactly how your army will move, and when, and where. You build railways, because railways are how you move armies quickly, and the railway timetables become part of the military plans, and the military plans become part of the political calculations, until eventually the whole thing is so tightly interlocked that changing any one part of it becomes almost impossible. The armies were not just weapons. They were systems. And systems, once set in motion, have a terrible tendency to run. There is something quietly exhausting about this period of history. Reading about it, really sitting with it, you can feel the weight of it pressing down on everyone involved. The statesmen who signed the treaties and built the alliances were not, for the most part, foolish men or wicked men. Many of them were thoughtful, experienced, genuinely concerned with preserving peace. But they were caught in a logic that was larger than any of them. Each step seemed reasonable in isolation. Germany builds ships, Britain builds more. Reasonable. France sees Germany's growing army, France expands its own. Reasonable. Russia feels encircled, Russia mobilizes more men. Reasonable. And with each reasonable step, the stakes grew higher. The margins for error grew smaller. The window for diplomacy grew narrower. It is the nature of arms races that they breed exactly the fear they are meant to prevent. Each nation, looking across its borders, saw not its neighbor's fear, but its neighbor's power. And power, when you are afraid, looks very much like threat. Europe in the years before 1914 was a continent of nations who were each, in their own way, genuinely frightened. And frightened nations do frightening things. Before the war came, it almost came. Twice. And perhaps that is one of the strangest things about the summer of 1914, that it was not the first time Europe had stood at the edge and looked down. It had been there before. And both times, it had stepped back. Find Morocco on a map and you will see it sitting at the northwestern corner of Africa, where the continent reaches up toward Europe across the narrow blue strip of the Strait of Gibraltar. It is a land of ancient cities and mountain ranges and long Atlantic coastlines. Of souks filled with color and noise and the smell of spices. Of minarets rising above flat-roofed houses in the warm evening air. In 1905, Morocco was still an independent sultanate. Not yet colonized. Not yet claimed by any of the great European powers. But France had its eye on it. France had been extending its influence across North Africa for decades. Algeria had been French since 1830, and Tunisia since 1881. Morocco was the obvious next piece of the puzzle. France had already reached quiet agreements with Britain and Spain about their respective interests there. It seemed, to France, like a relatively straightforward matter. Germany disagreed. Not because Germany particularly wanted Morocco for itself, but because Germany wanted to make a point. The new men running German foreign policy, the men who had dismissed Bismarck, who had let the Russian treaty lapse, who were steering the great ship of the German Empire with rather less skill than their predecessor, had developed a strategy. They called it, in their internal discussions, a policy of assertion. The idea was this: by intervening loudly and dramatically in international disputes, Germany could demonstrate its power, intimidate its rivals, and perhaps most importantly, drive a wedge between France and Britain, whose new Entente cordial was still young and untested. Surely, the German strategists reasoned, if they pushed hard enough, France and Britain would disagree about how to respond. The alliance would crack. France would be isolated. And Germany would have shown the world that it was a force to be reckoned with. It was a reasonable theory. It was also completely wrong. On the morning of the 31st of March, 1905, the German imperial yacht steamed into the harbor of Tangier, on the Moroccan coast. And Kaiser Wilhelm II stepped ashore. He had not particularly wanted to come. His advisors had insisted. He was nervous about the horse he was supposed to ride. It was reported to be skittish, and the Kaiser, with his withered arm, always found riding a challenge, and he was not at all certain this theatrical gesture would accomplish what his ministers promised. But come he did. He rode through the streets of Tangier. He met with the Sultan's representative. He gave a speech declaring that Germany recognized Morocco as a sovereign and independent nation, and that Germany expected to be consulted in any decisions about its future. It was, in diplomatic terms, a direct challenge to France. And France was shaken. For a few weeks, the crisis was genuinely alarming. War seemed possible. France's foreign minister, who had been the architect of the Entente cordial, was pushed out of office, partly under German pressure. A great international conference was called, to be held at Algeciras in Spain, to settle the question of Morocco's future. Germany arrived at that conference expecting to be vindicated. Expecting France to be humiliated. expecting, perhaps, to see the cracks appear in the Anglo-French relationship. Instead, almost every nation at the conference sided with France. Britain stood firmly behind its new partner. Russia supported France. Even Italy, officially part of Germany's own Triple Alliance, declined to back Berlin. Germany got almost nothing. France's position in Morocco was confirmed. And the Entente cordial, rather than cracking under pressure, had been strengthened by it. You might think that after Algeciras, Germany would have reflected on what had happened, would have recognized that its policy of dramatic confrontation was not working, was, in fact, doing the opposite of what it intended, pushing Britain and France closer together rather than apart. You might think that. But the men now steering German policy had a particular quality that is, sadly, not uncommon among the powerful. They were very good at explaining away their failures. Algeciras, they told themselves, was a temporary setback. The Entente was not as solid as it appeared. Next time, they would push harder. Next time, they would be firmer. Next time, France would blink. And so, 6 years later, there was a next time. The summer of 1911 was warm and golden across Europe. In the cafes of Paris, people sat outside in the evening light and read their newspapers. In Berlin, the fashionable streets were busy with people enjoying the long, bright days. In London, the social season was in full swing. And then, in July, a small German gunboat called the Panther sailed into the harbour of Agadir, on the Atlantic coast of Morocco. It was a dramatic gesture. Deliberately so. France had been moving troops into Morocco, ostensibly to put down a rebellion, but in effect extending its control over the country. Germany objected. And to make its objection felt in the most visible way possible, it sent a warship. The Panther was not, by any measure, a fearsome vessel. It was small. It carried a crew of only a few dozen men. Its guns were modest. But it was a symbol. And symbols, in the world of 1911, were everything. The crisis that followed, known as the Agadir crisis, or sometimes as the Second Moroccan Crisis, was more serious than the first. For several weeks, war between Germany and France seemed genuinely possible. Britain made its position unmistakably clear. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, David Lloyd George, a man not generally known for his interest in foreign affairs, gave a speech at the Mansion House in London that sent an unambiguous message to Berlin. Britain, he said, would not be treated as if it were of no account in the Cabinet of Nations. It was a warning. Quiet in tone. Absolute in meaning. Germany, once again, backed down. Morocco became a French protectorate. Germany received a portion of the French Congo as compensation, territory it had never particularly wanted, in exchange for humiliation it would not forget. And here is where the story of the near misses becomes important in a way that goes beyond Morocco itself. Because of what these crises did to the people living through them. On one side, in Britain, in France, in Russia, there was a growing conviction that Germany was a bully. That it would push and push and push, looking for weakness, looking for an opening. That the only language it understood was firmness. Resolve. Give Germany an inch, and it will take a mile. That was the lesson the Entente powers drew. And on the other side, in Germany, in Austria-Hungary, there was a growing bitterness and humiliation. Germany had tried, twice, to assert itself. Twice, it had been faced down by a coalition of powers that seemed determined to keep it in its place. To deny it the respect and the global standing that its strength and its achievements deserved. We are being encircled, German strategists and politicians told each other. Hemmed in. Contained. Next time, some of them began to think, we cannot afford to back down. Both sides drew the wrong lessons from the right events. The near misses, rather than teaching Europe how close it had come to catastrophe, had simply raised the stakes for the next time. And there would be a next time. The Balkans were stirring again. And this time, the crisis would not be so easily contained. Some historians call them the dress rehearsal. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913. Two conflicts, fought in quick succession, in that beautiful and complicated corner of southeastern Europe. They did not involve the great powers directly. Not yet. But they reshaped the map. They inflamed old passions. They made certain nations bolder, and certain other nations more afraid. And they brought the powder keg one step closer to the flame. We spoke, earlier, of the Ottoman Empire retreating. Of that great old power, which had once stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, slowly, painfully withdrawing from the Balkans over the course of the 19th century. By 1912, that process was nearly complete. The Ottomans still held a strip of territory in the southeastern corner of Europe, a region called Thrace, along with the city of Adrianople and the area around it. Old, historic land. Land that had been under Ottoman rule for 500 years. And the nations of the Balkans, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro, looked at that remaining territory and decided the time had come. They formed an alliance. The Balkan League, they called it. An unlikely partnership between nations that had their own rivalries and their own conflicting ambitions, but who shared, for this moment at least, a common purpose. To drive the Ottomans out of Europe entirely. The First Balkan War began in October of 1912. And it went, for the Balkan League, extraordinarily well. The Ottoman forces, stretched thin, poorly supplied, fighting on multiple fronts, collapsed with a speed that shocked the watching great powers of Europe. Within weeks, Bulgarian forces were within striking distance of Constantinople itself, the great ancient city on the Bosphorus, the seat of the Ottoman sultans, one of the most storied cities in the history of the world. They did not take it. They came close, but supply lines stretched, momentum faltered, and the advance stopped short. But elsewhere, the story was one of Ottoman defeat after Ottoman defeat. By the time an armistice was signed in the spring of 1913, the Ottoman Empire had lost almost all of its remaining European territory. 500 years of rule, undone in a matter of months. But then, as so often happens in history, the alliance that had won the war began to argue about the peace. The Balkan League had been united by a common enemy. Without that enemy, they had only each other. The central question was Macedonia, a large and strategically important region in the heart of the Balkans, with a mixed population of Slavs, Greeks, Albanians, and others. Bulgaria felt it deserved the largest share of Macedonia, in recognition of the enormous contribution its army had made to the war effort. Serbia and Greece disagreed strongly. Negotiations broke down. And in June of 1913, Bulgaria launched a surprise attack on its former allies. The Second Balkan War had begun. It was shorter than the first, and far more bitter. Serbia and Greece fought back immediately. Romania, which had stayed out of the First War, now joined in against Bulgaria, seeing an opportunity to gain territory. Even the Ottomans, sensing their chance, advanced to reclaim some of what they had lost. Bulgaria found itself fighting on 4 fronts simultaneously. It was overwhelmed. Within weeks, it sued for peace. The Treaty of Bucharest, signed in August of 1913, redrew the map of the Balkans once again. Serbia came out of the two wars dramatically enlarged. It had nearly doubled in size and population. Its army had proved itself capable, its commanders experienced, its soldiers hardened by real warfare. Serbia was, by any measure, the great winner of the Balkan Wars. And Austria-Hungary watched this with something approaching dread. To understand what Austria-Hungary felt in the autumn of 1913, you have to understand what Serbia now represented to them. Before the Balkan Wars, Serbia had been a small, Poor, landlocked kingdom. Troublesome, yes. Irritating, certainly. But containable. Now, Serbia was something different. It had territory on the Adriatic coast. It had a battle-tested army. It had the confidence, the almost intoxicating confidence, of a nation that had won 2 wars in quick succession and emerged stronger than anyone had expected. And Serbia still burned with that great national dream. Yugoslavia. The land of the South Slavs. The millions of South Slavic people living inside Austria-Hungary's borders, in Bosnia, in Croatia, in Slovenia, or watching Serbia's rise with excitement and longing. Look what Serbia has done, they said to one another. Look what is possible. In Vienna, in the great Baroque offices of the Austrian government, this was viewed with something close to existential terror. The chief of the Austrian General Staff, a man named Franz Conrad von Hotzendorf, had been arguing for years that the only solution to the Serbian problem was a short, decisive war. Crush Serbia before it grew any stronger. Before its example became too inspiring. Before the empire began to unravel from within. Conrad had actually proposed war against Serbia no fewer than 25 times between 1906 and 1914. 25 times. He had been refused each time, by the old Emperor Franz Joseph, who was cautious and weary and had seen too many wars in his long life to be eager for another. But the old emperor was 83 years old now. And Conrad was still waiting. There is one more thing the Balkan Wars did. That mattered enormously for what came next. They showed everyone what modern warfare actually looked like. The weapons that had been developed in the decades of the arms race, the rifles, the machine guns, the heavy artillery, had now been used in anger. And the results were sobering. The casualties in the Balkan Wars were staggering. Tens of thousands of men killed in battles that lasted only days. Villages burned. Civilian populations displaced. The sheer industrial scale of destruction that modern weapons could produce was laid out for all to see. Military observers from the great powers were present throughout the Balkan Wars. They watched. They took notes. They sent reports back to their governments. Some of those reports contained warnings. Warnings about the devastating effectiveness of defensive positions and machine guns against attacking infantry. Warnings about the enormous logistical demands of modern warfare. Warnings that a European war would be nothing like the quick, clean, decisive campaigns that the military planners had imagined. Some people read those warnings and grew more cautious. But others, particularly in Austria-Hungary and Germany, drew a different conclusion. They looked at Serbia's success and saw what a determined, well-led smaller power could achieve against a weakened opponent. They looked at the speed of the Ottoman collapse and saw that wars could still be won quickly, if you struck hard enough and fast enough. They told themselves that their armies were far superior to anything that had fought in the Balkans. That their planning was more thorough. Their soldiers better trained. Their generals more capable. It would be different for them. It would be quick. It would be decisive. They were wrong, of course. But they did not know that yet. The stage was nearly set. The players were nearly in position. And somewhere in the city of Sarajevo, a young man was sharpening his convictions. Until now, we have been telling the story of forces. Of empires and alliances and arms races and national dreams. Of the great, slow, impersonal pressures that were bending Europe toward breaking point. But history is not only made by forces. It is made by people. And now, it is time to meet one of them. The Habsburg dynasty had been ruling Austria for 600 years. 600 years. Think about that for a moment. When the Habsburgs first rose to power, the Black Death was still a living memory. Christopher Columbus had not yet been born. The printing press did not exist. The Americas were unknown to European eyes. And still, 6 centuries later, the Habsburgs were there. Still ruling. Still presiding over their vast, complicated, multi-ethnic empire from their great palace in Vienna. The man on the throne in 1914 was Emperor Franz Joseph I. He was 83 years old. He had been emperor since 1848, 66 years. He had come to the throne as a young man of 18 and had outlasted almost everyone he had ever known. He had known triumph and he had known sorrow in equal measure. His brother, Maximilian, had been executed by a firing squad in Mexico in 1867, after a disastrous attempt to make himself emperor of that country. His wife, the beautiful and melancholy Empress Elizabeth, known to her people as Sisi, had been assassinated by an Italian anarchist in Geneva in 1898. Stabbed with a sharpened file while walking along a lakeside promenade. His only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, had died in 1889 in a mysterious and scandalous incident at a hunting lodge called Meierling, an apparent suicide pact with his young mistress that shook the empire to its foundations. Franz Joseph had buried them all. And carried on. Because that was what emperors did. But Rudolf's death had created a problem. The emperor had no direct heir. And so the succession passed to his nephew, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Franz Ferdinand was not, by most accounts, an easy man to like. He was stocky and broad-shouldered, with the heavy dark moustache that seemed almost compulsory among the men of his class and era. He had a quick temper that those around him learned to navigate carefully. He could be brusque, impatient, dismissive of people he considered fools, and his definition of fool was, by some accounts, rather generous. He loved hunting with an almost obsessive intensity. He kept meticulous records of every animal he had ever shot. The count, by the end of his life, ran to somewhere in the region of 300,000 creatures. It is a number that sits uncomfortably with modern sensibilities. He was not his uncle's favorite. Franz Joseph found his nephew difficult, and the feeling was largely mutual. And yet, beneath the difficult exterior, there were qualities in Franz Ferdinand that history has not always given him credit for. He was, for his time and his position, genuinely thoughtful about the future of the empire. Where many of his contemporaries saw the empire's diversity, all those languages, all those peoples, all those competing national identities, as a problem to be suppressed, Franz Ferdinand saw it differently. He wanted to reform the empire. To restructure it. To give its many peoples a greater degree of autonomy and self-government, while keeping them bound together under the Habsburg crown. He called his vision, informally, the United States of Greater Austria. It was, in many ways, a remarkably modern idea for a man of his background. And it was an idea that terrified the Serbian nationalists. Because if Franz Ferdinand succeeded, if he reformed the empire and gave its South Slavic peoples genuine rights and representation, then the great dream of Yugoslavia, of drawing those peoples away from Austria and into a new South Slavic state, would become much harder to achieve. A reformed, federal Austria-Hungary that treated its Slavic subjects well, was actually a greater threat to Serbian ambitions than a cruel, repressive one. But before we go further into the politics, let us pause for a moment on something more personal. Because Franz Ferdinand had a secret. Or rather, it had been a secret, once. By 1914, it was known to everyone. But it had begun as something private and fierce and completely at odds with the world he lived in. He was deeply, utterly, and by all accounts genuinely in love with his wife. This sounds unremarkable. But in the world of European royalty and aristocracy at the turn of the century, it was almost scandalously unusual. Royal marriages were arrangements, alliances, mergers between dynasties. Love was considered, at best, a pleasant bonus, and more often, an irrelevant consideration entirely. But Franz Ferdinand had fallen in love with a woman named Sophie Chotek. Sophie was a lady-in-waiting, a member of the minor Bohemian nobility, respectable but nowhere near the level required for a Habsburg match. The ancient protocols of the dynasty were absolutely clear on the matter. An archduke could not marry someone of insufficient rank. Franz Joseph refused his permission. The court was scandalized. The pressure on Franz Ferdinand to give Sophie up and find a suitable bride was enormous. He refused. For years, he simply refused. And eventually, in 1900, a compromise was reached. Franz Ferdinand was allowed to marry Sophie, but only under the condition of a morganatic marriage. A legal arrangement that stripped their children of all rights to the succession. Any children they had could never inherit. Sophie herself could never be empress. At court functions, she was required to take a lower place than even minor archduchesses. At the opera, at state dinners, at official ceremonies, she was reminded, again and again, of her inferior status. Franz Ferdinand found this treatment of his wife deeply wounding. And yet, by every account, their marriage was one of extraordinary happiness. They had 3 children. They spent their time together at their beloved estate of Konopist in Bohemia, where Sophie tended her roses and Franz Ferdinand tended his game reserves, and for a few hours each day they could simply be a family. People who knew them remarked on it, again and again. In private, away from the rigidities of court life, Franz Ferdinand was a different man. Warm, attentive, devoted. He loved his wife. And that love would, in a small but real way, contribute to his death. In the spring of 1914, it was decided that Archduke Franz Ferdinand would travel to Bosnia. Bosnia was a province of Austria-Hungary, annexed formally in 1908, a move that had caused a diplomatic crisis and left Serbia furious, since Bosnia was home to a large South Slavic population that Serbia considered its natural brothers. Franz Ferdinand would attend military maneuvers in the Bosnian hills. And afterward, he would make an official visit to Sarajevo, the provincial capital. A city of minarets and market streets, of old Ottoman architecture alongside newer Austro-Hungarian municipal buildings, a place where East and West had been living alongside each other, not always comfortably, for centuries. The date chosen for the visit to Sarajevo was the 28th of June, 1914. It was, for reasons that will become important, a date with enormous symbolic weight for the Serbian people. June the 28th was the feast day of Saint Vitus, Vidovdan in Serbian. And Vidovdan was the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, the day a Serbian army had been defeated by the Ottomans, the day that had begun 5 centuries of foreign rule. It was the most sacred and sorrowful date in the Serbian national calendar. A day of memory and longing and pride. To hold an Austrian military celebration in a Slavic city on that particular day was, to say the least, poorly judged. And there was one more reason why Sophie was glad to be going. On official visits, the rules of the morganatic marriage were relaxed. When Franz Ferdinand was acting in his military capacity, as Inspector General of the Imperial Armed Forces, Sophie was permitted to ride beside him in the open car. She could be, for once, at his side. Equal. They set off together. Into the bright June morning. The morning of the 28th of June, 1914, was warm. Sarajevo sat in a narrow river valley, surrounded on all sides by green hills that rose steeply toward the sky. The Miljacka River ran through the heart of the city, crossed by a series of small stone bridges. The streets along its banks were lined with shops and cafes and the offices of the Austro-Hungarian administration. It was, by any measure, a beautiful morning. The kind of morning that makes you glad to be alive. But scattered along the route of the Archduke's motorcade, 7 young men were waiting. They had been sent by a secret society. The society had several names, but it is most commonly known to history as the Black Hand, a Serbian nationalist organization with deep and murky connections to the Serbian military intelligence services. Its stated purpose was the unification of all South Slavic peoples. Its methods were not peaceful. The 7 men stationed along the Apple Quay, the wide boulevard that ran alongside the river, were young. Some were very young. The youngest was just 17 years old. They were armed with pistols and with small hand grenades, cylindrical, about the size of a large cigar, that had to be primed by knocking them against a hard surface before throwing. They had been given cyanide capsules. They were expected, if captured, to take their own lives. They had been trained, after a fashion, in Serbia, in the wooded hills outside Belgrade. Some of them could handle a weapon with reasonable competence. Others could not. They were nervous. Deeply nervous. Several of them, standing at their posts along the quay in the warm morning sunshine, surrounded by the cheerful crowds that had turned out to see the royal visit, were almost paralyzed with fear and doubt. The leader of the group, the one who had done the most to organize the operation, was a 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip. He was slight, pale, and intense. He had grown up in poverty in the Bosnian countryside, the son of a postman. He had come to Sarajevo to study, had become consumed by nationalist ideas, had drifted into the orbit of the Black Hand. He believed, with the burning certainty of the very young, that what he was doing was right. That it was necessary. That it would change the world. He was correct about the last part. Shortly after 10 o'clock in the morning, the motorcade set off from the railway station. 6 cars. Open-topped, because the day was fine and it was considered important for the Archduke and his wife to be seen by the crowds. Franz Ferdinand sat in the 3rd car, a large, dark green open touring car, a Graf und Stift. He was in his full military uniform. Sophie sat beside him in a white dress and a wide-brimmed hat decorated with flowers. They were smiling. The crowds along the Apple Quay were thick and welcoming. Flags were waving. People pressed forward to see the Archduke and his wife. The cars moved at a reasonable pace along the riverside boulevard. And then, at a point near the Q merger bridge, something happened. One of the conspirators, a young man named Nedeljko Kabrinović. He knocked his grenade against a lamp post to prime it. And he threw it at the Archduke's car. Franz Ferdinand saw it coming. He raised his arm, an instinctive, almost impossibly brave gesture, and deflected the grenade away from the car. It bounced off the folded-back convertible roof and landed in the street behind the motorcade, beneath the following car. It exploded. Several members of the Archduke's entourage were wounded. 2 of them seriously. The street filled with smoke and screaming and confusion. Kabrinović, realizing he had failed, swallowed his cyanide capsule and threw himself into the Miljacka River. But the cyanide was old. Ineffective. It made him violently ill but did not kill him. And the river, at that time of year, was only a few inches deep. He was dragged out by the crowd, bleeding and retching, and arrested. The motorcade did not stop. The cars accelerated, driving quickly away from the scene. And the other 6 conspirators, watching the chaos unfold from their positions along the quay, lost their nerve one by one. They did not act. The motorcade passed them. And the Archduke reached the town hall alive. At the town hall, there was an official reception. Franz Ferdinand was shaken, but he was also furious. He interrupted the mayor's welcoming speech with barely contained anger. "I come to Sarajevo on a friendly visit," he said, "and someone throws a bomb at me." After a tense discussion, it was decided that the motorcade would change its route. Rather than continuing with the planned program, they would drive directly to the hospital to visit the members of the entourage who had been wounded in the explosion. The change of route was communicated to the drivers. Or rather, it was communicated to most of the drivers. The lead driver had not been told. And so when the motorcade set off again, the lead car turned, as originally planned, onto Franz Joseph Street, heading away from the river. The car carrying Franz Ferdinand and Sophie followed. When Count Potiorek, the governor of Bosnia, sitting in the front seat of the Archduke's car, realized the mistake, he told the driver to stop. The driver stopped. He put the car into reverse. And as the car paused, stalled and turning on the corner of Franz Joseph Street and the Apple Quay, it stopped almost directly in front of a small delicatessen. A delicatessen where, having abandoned his post along the quay in despair and confusion after the failed assassination attempt, Gavrilo Princip was standing, having a sandwich. What happened next took only a few seconds. Princip saw the car. He saw Franz Ferdinand. He saw Sophie. He stepped forward. He raised his pistol. He fired twice. The first bullet struck Franz Ferdinand in the jugular vein. The second struck Sophie in the abdomen. The car lurched forward, the driver accelerating desperately away from the scene. Count Potiorek, in the front seat, turned and saw Franz Ferdinand upright, blood beginning to pour from his neck. Sophie had slumped forward. Franz Ferdinand looked at her. "Sopherl," he said, his pet name for her. "Sopherl. Don't die. Stay alive for our children." She did not answer. She was already gone. Franz Ferdinand died in the car, somewhere between the corner of Franz Joseph Street and the governor's residence, still repeating the words, quietly, fading, "It is nothing, it is nothing, it is nothing." By 11:15 in the morning, both of them were dead. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire and his wife. On the feast day of Saint Vitus. In a city that had been preparing for a celebration. For a moment, after events like this, the world is very quiet. News traveled slowly by the standards of our own age, though quickly by the standards of any age before it. By telegraph, by telephone, by word of mouth spreading outward from Sarajevo like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. In Vienna, Franz Joseph, 83 years old, who had buried so many people he loved, received the news in the early afternoon. He wept. In Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm was on his yacht, taking part in a sailing regatta. A message was brought to him on the water. He turned his yacht around and sailed back to shore. In London, in Paris, in St. Petersburg, the news arrived. And people shook their heads, and felt the sadness that attaches to violent death, and perhaps wondered what it would mean. Most of them assumed it would mean a diplomatic crisis. A period of tension. The arrest and punishment of the conspirators. Perhaps some punishing demands made of Serbia. Terrible, of course. But manageable. They had managed crises before. They would manage this one. Surely. 37 days. That is all the time there was. Between the shots in Sarajevo and the first declarations of war. 37 days in which the world might have chosen differently. In which wiser counsel might have prevailed. In which the machinery, still not fully set in motion, might yet have been stopped. It was not stopped. But it almost was. And the story of those 37 days is one of the most important stories ever told. In Vienna, in the days after the assassination, the mood in the government was one of cold fury. Here, at last, was the pretext that Konrad von Hotzendorf and the hardliners had been waiting for. A clear act of aggression. A murder on Austro-Hungarian soil, carried out by conspirators with links, murky, difficult to prove, but real, to Serbian nationalist networks. Here was the justification for the short, decisive war against Serbia that they had long argued for. But Austria-Hungary had learned from the Balkan crises. It knew that it could not move against Serbia without first securing the support of its great ally, Germany. And so, on the 5th of July, the Austrian ambassador traveled to Berlin and met with Kaiser Wilhelm. The Kaiser's response was immediate. Germany, he said, would back Austria-Hungary fully. Whatever Austria-Hungary decided to do, Germany would support it. He said this without consulting his generals, without convening his cabinet, without, it appears, thinking through the implications with any great care. He then left for his summer cruise. This assurance, this promise of unconditional German support, is known to history as the blank check. Austria-Hungary could fill in whatever amount it liked. And it was, by any measure, one of the most consequential and reckless decisions of the entire crisis. Because it removed the one restraint that might have made Austria-Hungary pause. The fear of acting alone. Now it would not be alone. And the hawks in Vienna began to sharpen their terms. It took Austria-Hungary 2.5 weeks to prepare its response to the assassination. The delay was deliberate, in part. France's President Poincaré was visiting St. Petersburg, meeting with Tsar Nicholas, cementing the Franco-Russian alliance. Austria-Hungary waited until his ship had left Russian waters before acting. The last thing they wanted was France and Russia coordinating their response in real time. On the 23rd of July, Austria-Hungary delivered its ultimatum to Serbia. It was a remarkable document. 10 demands. Each one carefully designed to be either impossible to accept or deeply humiliating if accepted. Austria-Hungary demanded that Serbia suppress all anti-Austrian publications. That it dissolve certain nationalist organizations. That it dismiss specific military officers. That it allow Austro-Hungarian officials to participate directly in the Serbian judicial investigation into the assassination. That last demand was the sharpest. The most deliberate. Because it was a direct infringement of Serbian sovereignty. To allow a foreign power to conduct its own investigation on your soil, to arrest your own citizens, to run its own legal proceedings inside your borders, was to cease, in any meaningful sense, to be an independent nation. Serbia had 48 hours to reply. The Serbian government worked through the night of the 24th of July. When their reply came, it surprised almost everyone. Serbia accepted, with minor modifications, 9 of the 10 demands. The one it could not accept, it said, with deep respect and regret, was the demand for Austro-Hungarian officials to participate in the judicial proceedings on Serbian soil. This, Serbia said, would be incompatible with its sovereignty and its constitution. But it offered to submit the matter to the International Court at The Hague. It was, by the standards of the age, an extraordinary act of conciliation from a small nation facing an enormous one. Even Kaiser Wilhelm, reading the Serbian reply back in Berlin, having cut short his cruise, was impressed. A great moral victory for Vienna, he wrote in the margins of the document. Every reason for war disappears. He suggested that Austria-Hungary occupy Belgrade briefly, as a guarantee, and then negotiate. It was, perhaps, the most sensible thing the Kaiser said during the entire crisis. His suggestion was ignored. Because in Vienna, the decision had already effectively been made. War. On the 28th of July, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. 1 month, almost to the day, after the shots in Sarajevo. And now the alliance system, that great web of promises that had been woven across Europe over the previous 30 years, began to pull tight. Russia could not stand by while Austria-Hungary crushed Serbia. The Tsar and his government had watched the Balkan crises of the previous decade with growing alarm. They had backed down before. During the Bosnian crisis of 1908, Russia had been forced to accept Austria-Hungary's annexation without response, and the humiliation still stung. They had been told, bluntly, by Germany, that if they intervened they would face consequences. They had backed down. They would not back down again. On the 29th of July, Russia began a partial mobilization of its armed forces. It was a warning shot. A signal to Vienna that Russia was watching, and was prepared to act. But mobilization, as we have discussed, had its own terrible momentum. Germany watched Russia's mobilization with alarm and issued an ultimatum. Stop. Stand down. Or Germany would mobilize in response. Russia did not stop. On the 1st of August, Germany declared war on Russia. And now the Schlieffen Plan, that great, meticulous, years-in-the-making blueprint for a two-front war, came grinding into motion. Germany could not fight Russia in the east without first neutralizing France in the west. That had always been the logic. And so, even as the guns began to sound on the Eastern Front, Germany turned its eyes westward. On the 3rd of August, Germany declared war on France. And then, because the Schlieffen Plan required it, German forces crossed the border into neutral Belgium. The plan demanded a sweeping movement through Belgium and into northern France, bypassing the heavily fortified Franco-German border. Belgium was neutral. Had been neutral since 1839. Its neutrality had been guaranteed by a treaty signed by all the great powers, including Britain. Britain now faced its moment of decision. There had been fierce debate in the British cabinet. Several ministers threatened to resign. Britain was not obligated, under the terms of its entente with France, to go to war automatically. The entente was not a full military alliance. There was, technically, a choice. But Belgium changed everything. Britain sent Germany an ultimatum. Withdraw from Belgium by midnight on the 4th of August. Germany did not withdraw. At 11 o'clock on the night of the 4th of August, 1914, midnight in Berlin, the British ultimatum expired. Britain was at war. There is a moment, on that evening of the 4th of August, that has passed into history. Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, was standing at his office window in Whitehall as darkness fell over London. Outside, the lamplighters were making their evening rounds, moving from lamp to lamp along the street below. He watched them for a moment. And then he said, to a friend standing beside him, quietly, almost to himself, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." He was right. The world that had existed before that night, the world of grand empires and glittering courts and long summer afternoons and the assumption, held by so many for so long, that progress was inevitable and civilization was advancing and the worst was always behind us. That world was over. In 4 years of war that followed, 20 million people would die. Empires that had stood for centuries would collapse. Maps would be redrawn beyond recognition. A generation of young men, in France, in Britain, in Germany, in Russia, in Austria, in Serbia and Bulgaria and the Ottoman lands, would be fed into the machinery of modern warfare and emerge broken, or not emerge at all. And the peace that followed, if peace is even the right word for what came after, would contain within it the seeds of an even greater catastrophe. 20 years later. But that is another story. For another night. We have spoken of empires and alliances, of statesmen and ultimatums and the cold calculations of power. But history is not only made in government offices and royal palaces. It is made in kitchens and workshops and village squares. In the hearts of ordinary people, who woke up one morning in the summer of 1914 and found that the world had changed while they slept. In the days following the declarations of war, something happened across the cities of Europe that historians have debated ever since. The crowds came out. In Berlin, in Vienna, in Paris, in London and St. Petersburg and Belgrade. People gathered in the streets and the squares. And many of them, not all, but many, were not weeping. They were cheering. In Berlin, enormous crowds filled the Unter den Linden, the great ceremonial boulevard that ran through the heart of the city. Kaiser Wilhelm appeared on the balcony of the city palace and spoke to the crowd below. "I no longer recognize any parties," he declared. "I recognize only Germans. The crowd roared. In Paris, men linked arms and sang the Marseillaise, their faces open and bright with something that looked, from a distance, almost like joy. In London, the crowds outside Buckingham Palace called for the king, and when he appeared they cheered until they were hoarse. How do we make sense of this? How do we understand people celebrating the beginning of something that would kill 20 million of them? There are several answers. And they are not comfortable ones. The first is simply that people did not know what was coming. The last major war that most Europeans could remember, or had heard their parents speak of, was the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. A war that had lasted only a few months. That had been decided by a handful of sharp, decisive engagements. That was the template that most people carried in their minds. War was sharp. War was brief. War produced a result, and then it was over, and life resumed. Nobody, or almost nobody, imagined 4 years of industrial slaughter. 4 years of trenches and poison gas and bombardments that went on for weeks. Nobody imagined the Somme, or Passchendaele, or Verdun. They thought it would be over by Christmas. Almost everyone thought that. The second reason people cheered is harder to speak about, but important. Many of them were bored. This sounds almost obscene in retrospect. But the Europe of 1914, particularly for young men in the cities, had a particular quality of restlessness. The industrial age had brought prosperity and security, but it had also brought routine. Factory whistles and office hours and the same streets every day and a vague, nagging feeling that life ought to contain more than this. War promised adventure. Purpose. Brotherhood. The chance to be part of something enormous and meaningful. Young men who had spent their days behind counters and desks suddenly imagined themselves as heroes. And the third reason, perhaps the deepest, was simply that people believed what their governments told them. Every government told its people the same thing. We did not want this war. It was forced upon us. We are fighting in self-defense. Our cause is just. In Germany, people believed they were defending the fatherland against Russian aggression. In France, people believed they were finally, reclaiming the honor lost in 1871. In Britain, people believed they were defending the rights of small nations and the rule of law. In Russia, people believed they were protecting their Slavic brothers from Austrian tyranny. Everyone believed they were on the right side. Everyone believed the other side had started it. And in the warm, bright August of 1914, most of them marched away believing they would be home before the leaves fell. But not everyone cheered. It is important to say that. Because the image of cheering crowds can obscure the quieter, harder, more honest responses that were also there. In the working-class districts of every European city, there were men and women who looked at the declarations of war with dread rather than excitement. Who understood, with a bleak clarity, that it would not be the politicians and the generals who would do the dying. It would be their sons. In Britain, the anti-war movement had been vocal right up until the moment Germany invaded Belgium. Several cabinet ministers, as we have mentioned, came close to resigning. Ordinary people gathered outside the offices of the Manchester Guardian newspaper, which had argued against intervention, and waited for news. In France, the socialist leader Jean-Jaurès, who had spent years trying to build an international workers' movement that would refuse to fight a war between nations, was assassinated in a Paris café on the night of the 31st of July. Shot by a French nationalist who feared Jaurès would undermine the war effort. He was killed the day before France mobilized. The movement he had built largely dissolved within days. Its members went to war like everyone else. In Germany, the Social Democratic Party, the largest socialist party in the world, theoretically committed to international solidarity above national loyalty, voted in the Reichstag to approve war credits. They voted for the war. The International, the great dream of a workers' solidarity that would transcend borders, did not survive the summer of 1914. Nationalism, in the end, proved stronger than ideology. It almost always does. Let us end this section not with politicians or crowds, but with a few ordinary people. A farmer in Normandy, in the north of France. He had spent that summer bringing in the harvest. His wheat was cut and stacked. His apple trees were heavy with fruit. His two sons, 18 and 22, received their mobilization papers on the 3rd of August. He drove them to the station in his cart the following morning. The platform was crowded. There was noise and color, flags, uniforms, the sound of a brass band. He shook their hands. He did not trust himself to do more. He did not know that he would never see the younger one again. A schoolteacher in a small town in Württemberg, in southern Germany. She had spent July watching the newspapers with growing unease. She had a husband and a brother, both of a military age. When war was declared, she wrote in her diary. Her diary survived, and was published decades later. She wrote simply, "God help us all. We do not know what we have begun." A clerk in a London insurance office. 23 years old. He queued outside a recruitment office on the 5th of August, the day after Britain declared war, and waited for 3 hours in the August heat. He was turned away. The queue was too long. They would process him tomorrow. He went home, ate his supper, and went to bed early. He wanted to be rested for when he went back in the morning. He got his papers in September. He was in France by November. He survived the war, just barely, and not entirely whole. He never spoke about it afterward. Not once. Not to anyone. Historians often call it that. The last summer. The summer of 1914. The last summer of the world that had existed before. And there is something about that phrase, the last summer, that carries a particular kind of sadness. Because the people living through it did not know it was the last. They swam in rivers and walked in parks and ate long meals with their families and argued about small things and laughed at jokes and watched their children play. They did all the ordinary things that ordinary people do in summer. And some of those ordinary things, a walk in a particular meadow, an evening at a favorite cafe, a Sunday morning that felt like all Sunday mornings, they were doing for the last time. Without knowing it. There is a mercy in not knowing. But there is also a grief, looking back. In the space between what they had and what was coming. Sleep carries its own mercy like that. Washing the day away. Leaving only the quiet. We have come a long way tonight. A long, long way. From the candlelit conference rooms of Vienna in 1815. To the streets of Sarajevo on a warm June morning. From the shipyards of Hamburg and Portsmouth, where great steel vessels took shape in the fog. To the quiet farmyards of Normandy, where a father watched a train pull away from a platform. We have traveled far. And now, it is time to rest. The First World War lasted 4 years, 3 months, and 14 days. When it ended, in November of 1918, the world it left behind was almost unrecognizable from the one that had entered it. For great empires had fallen. The German Empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Ottoman Empire. The Russian Empire. For dynasties that had shaped the course of European history for centuries simply ceased to exist. In their place, new nations. New borders. New governments. New ideas about what the world might be, and who it might belong to. The map of Europe was redrawn so thoroughly that people who had been born in one country found themselves, without moving an inch, living in another. Whole cities changed hands. Languages that had been suppressed for generations suddenly found themselves official. Peoples who had dreamed of their own nations for 100 years suddenly had them. And millions of others found themselves on the wrong side of a new border. strangers in a land they had always called home. The peace, when it came, was called the Peace of Paris. It was not, in truth, much of a peace. The terms imposed on Germany were so harsh, so deliberately humiliating, that a young Austrian painter sitting in a Munich beer hall in the early 1920s, nursing his bitterness and his rage, would one day use them as the foundation of a political movement that would tear the world apart all over again. But that is a story for another night. There is a question that everyone asks, eventually, when they sit with the history of the First World War. Could it have been prevented? It is a question without a clean answer. Some historians say yes. Point to this decision or that moment, the blank check, the failure to heed Gray's warnings, the Austro-Hungarian refusal to negotiate, and say, here is where it could have gone differently. Other historians look at the whole long sweep of the story, the alliances, the arms race, the nationalism, the imperial rivalries, the decades of mounting pressure, and say that by 1914, the structure was so unstable that almost anything could have triggered it. That if not Sarajevo, then something else. Somewhere else. Some other spark. Perhaps both are right. Perhaps the truth is that it could have been prevented at 100 different moments across the preceding decades. And that by the summer of 1914, it was very nearly too late. Nearly. But not quite. And in that narrow, vanishing space between nearly and not quite, the whole terrible weight of the 20th century balanced. For 37 days. And then fell. In northern France. And in Flanders, in Belgium. There are fields. Wide, flat, quiet fields. In spring they are full of red poppies that come up through the dark earth without being planted, without being tended, without anyone asking them to. They simply come. Year after year. Red against the green. The farmers who work those fields sometimes turn up, with their plows, objects from a century ago. A belt buckle. A button. The rusted remnant of something that was once a tool of war. They set these things aside. And they keep working. The earth keeps working. The poppies keep coming. There is something in that, I think. Something that resists easy words. About persistence. And memory. And the quiet insistence of the living world. To keep growing. Through everything. The soldiers who fought in the First World War came home, those who came home. And largely did not speak of it. There were exceptions. There were men who wrote memoirs and poems and novels of searing power and beauty. Wilfred Owen. Siegfried Sassoon. Ernst Jünger. Henri Barbusse. Men who found in language a way to carry what they had seen. But most did not. Most came back to their villages and their towns and their families. And put it away somewhere deep inside themselves. And got on with living. They planted gardens. They fixed roofs. They watched their children grow. They sat by fires in winter and read their newspapers and went to bed at a reasonable hour. They were, by any measure, extraordinary people. Not because they were heroes in the way that word is usually meant. But because they got up every morning and faced a world that had asked more of them than any world should ask of anyone. And they kept going. Quietly. Without fuss. The way that most people, in most times, do most of the things that actually keep the world turning. We began tonight in a world that no longer exists. An old world. A complicated world. A world of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary cruelty, of grand ambitions and small kindnesses, of people who wanted desperately to matter. And mostly just wanted to live. We followed the long road that led from the Congress of Vienna. Through the rise of nationalism and the scramble for empire. Through the crises and the near misses. Through the shot on a bright June morning. To the lamps going out all over Europe. one by one. It is a road worth knowing. Not because knowing it changes anything about what happened, but because the past is part of what we are. The world you live in, the borders on the maps, the names of the nations, the shape of the international order, was forged, in part, in those 4 terrible years. The people who lived through it are gone now. The last veteran of the First World War died in 2012. 110 years old. He had been 18 when the war ended. Imagine the world he had seen. Imagine the weight of it. And imagine, too, the lightness of setting it down at last. It is late now. Very late. The story is told. The empires have fallen and the armies have marched and the treaties have been signed and the poppies have come up through the earth year after year after year. And somewhere in all of that are people just like you, who wanted what you want, who loved what you love, who lay down at the end of long days and listened to the quiet and felt, in spite of everything, the ordinary miracle of still being here, still breathing, still warm. You are still here. Your breath is slow and deep. The room is dark and soft. There is nothing left to carry tonight. Let the last 100 years drift away. Let the generals and the statesmen and the treaties and the guns go quiet. Let the fields of northern France lie still under their poppies. Let the lamps go out, one by one, all over Europe. And sleep come in. Softly. Like the tide. Like the end of a long, long summer day. Good night.